All right. My contact information, I'm ImaniHadden Photography. My Instagram is my first name and my last name. And you can contact me at ImaniHaddenPhotography@gmail.com. I'm available for career building sessions with high schoolers in the AV area, so that's Lancaster and Palmdale regions. So my background, I have a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Photography from Tulane University. I also have a double minor in art history and architecture. And I'm a personal event photographer and and a real estate photographer. I'm also a photographer for Peace in the Streets, an organization that I work with, and I am a visual artist. So some general rules, please stay muted with your screens off. Questions at the end, no homework, no note taking required, no testing. All right, so the albumin print follows the calotype. It was invented by Louis Desiré Blancat Evrard in 1869, and that is a selfie that he has made of himself. And also on the right, Jules Davy, it is his art that he's made. So the differences between the print, albumin print, and the calotype. The albumin print was sharper and more in focus, and it had a glossy finish because of the egg white, and the egg white was dipped before the contact print was made, versus the calotype, which was fuzzier, it was dull, and it had the finish of whatever paper was printed on, and it was salt dipped before the contact print was made. And the similarities were that they were both on cotton paper, they used a glass negative, they're both reproducible, and they both use silver nitrates. Okay, so the scientific process, it was large and long, but I've condensed it down to 5 steps. The cotton paper was coated in egg white and salt and then dried. The next step that it was used with silver nitrates and a water mixture, so it was dipped and then dried away from UV lighting. So pretty much in the dark room or in a dark place. The third step was that a glass frame and the negative were layered with the collodion emulsion negative in order to expose it to the UV light. So pretty much like a dark room, this individual has set it outside for the sunlight to develop it. The fourth step was a sodium thiosulfate bath, which keeps the print from overdeveloping and becoming too dark. And the last step was gold selenium toner can be added to help them make the print fade proof. So it wasn't necessary, but it was often used in order to make the print last longer. Europe explores its ancient roots. So Robert Turnbull McPherson was a photographer from Scotland, and he, like many other Europeans, went to Italy and Greece and looked at the ancient sculptures and took pictures and made images using the albumin prints. He went also into the Vatican. I'm not sure how you can enter the Vatican, at least within that chamber, but he was able to gain access. And he also took pictures of the ruins of the temple. Europeans also began to take photography to Asia and to document what they were seeing. So Felice Bieto had a complete album full of albumin prints that he had made in Japan and China. Stilfried Rentnis also went to China and Japan, and he documented his findings there. A majority of it was cultural prints, pictures of people posing. He had allowed them to, or they had allowed him rather, to make images of them. And it was very interesting to see how The pictures started off very tame, very respectful, very the usual thing that you would see, until pictures of Asian women, particularly Japanese women who are geishas, were also found among Stillfried Rent's imagery. And the idea that Asian women, particularly Japanese women who were geisha, were considered prostitutes in that time is completely incorrect. They were performers. They knew poetry. They knew the ancient Japanese languages, knew how to spell in kanji. They were much more than just pretty women for hire. However, Stillfried Rents most likely paid some of these women and posed them how he saw fit. The woman in the middle is how geisha typically dress in their cultural garb, and Stillfried Rents has put them to be more sensual. So not quite sexualized, but to show the skin from the waist up, or to imply nudity with an open blouse front, was very risque. And it was very much on purpose that he knew what he was doing when he posed these two women this way. So European occupation and the Asian inspired. I put Asian inspired in air quotes because if you are trying to mimic something, it is understood you are not the original. However, as Europeans entered the Southeast Asian region, they began to come in contact with differences in culture. I'm going to talk about the Dutch occupation in Indonesia, which started in the 1600s. So the old Indonesia was very much ethnic. People were extremely proud of their clothing. The man in the middle has traditional tattoos, which are very seen and understood to be local to the area, as well as other parts of Southeast Asia. And men who were warriors wore their garb and were seen and known and understood that this was normal part of their day-to-day culture. So royalty, the prince with two servants, a man in the public with his tattoos, very proudly showing them off, and then the two warriors that were a part of the royal palace. The new Indonesia made Indonesians subservient to the Dutch Europeans. The image on the left is a 1916 image that I found online, and it was from an individual who was recalling his family tree. So he is a Dutch individual, and this was actually out of his personal, personal yet published family album. And on the right, 2 years after Indonesia declared its independence from the Netherlands, a soldier still occupies Indonesia and hands out clothes because there is a textile shortage in the islands. So even after colonialism passes, things change. There is still the remnants of colonialism in Indonesia and in parts of Asia today due to European imperialism being so at the forefront. Margaretha Zell McLeod. She was a Dutch woman who had married a Dutch militaryman who had moved to Java, Indonesia. She was a high society girl, and when her marriage did not go well, she returned to the Netherlands, divorced her husband, and was officially single. And here she is, the far left, dressed in what European women wore at the time, and her husband and son are in the middle, and there's an image of her daughter to the far right. She returned to Europe and became Matahari. She danced in Paris at the height of the French Belle Epoque, which was the French Renaissance for the theater arts, literature, poetry, anything that was creative in that early 1900s era was part of the Belle Epoque. She combined strip teasing and Asian inspired dance. Notice again, I said inspired because the outfits that you see that she's wearing are reminiscent of maybe Middle Eastern belly dancing that had been seen at the time, some sort of Asian inspired, Southeast Asian Indian garb, but this was not what the women in Indonesia were wearing. Not at all, not even close. And when she went to France and toured Europe, she lied about her ethnicity. She said she had dark hair, dark eyes, and well, she had said dark skin as well, dark for being a European, because she was part Jewish and also part Indonesian, as well as being part European, which was not true. She had been discredited by family members who said, we are Dutch and just Dutch. She called her dances religious and ancient, and they were a sensation in late Victorian Europe. Many people had never really seen a naked woman in public, much less a naked dancing woman. And she had her dances in the Musée Guimet in Paris in the early 1900s. So people paid to come see her. She was a hit sensation. She started off dressed completely, as complete as can be, on the left. And by the end of the show, she was completely nude from the waist down. And that was very shocking for Victorians. It may not be shocking for us today, as we understand the clubs and the strip teases, things that have become a part of our society today. But back then, it was very, very, very shocking. She often code switched between exoticism and polite society. So she would hold her shows. When she was done holding her shows, she would continue to dress in her time period appropriate attire. So that image was taken in 1915. She was also a personal escort for politicians, and she ended up becoming a World War I spy until she was found out and sentenced to death by firing squad in 1917. So she had a very fast, hard party lifestyle. I didn't find much about what happened to her husband or her surviving children, but she was definitely a woman that pretty much did her own thing, and it was a really big deal. She was really famous, and even famous after death to this day. Now, Europeans' early travels to Africa, these images were also albumin prints, and a majority of them were British, some were French as well, and it showed ancient Egypt and ancient North Africa in particular. And the portrait is Francis Firth in his Turkish summer costume. They say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And these Europeans dressed, lived, ate, and saw how the people dressed, lived, and ate in North Africa. Francis Firth, British, the temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia, an Egyptian obelisk, Cleopatra's Needle, as it was renamed in 1870. Arnaud was a French photographer, and he focused on women and families in North Africa. As you note, the background is not a real background, but it is a false background or a backdrop. And he has organized the family of the date growers to pose for him in his imagery. It was also noted that the women covered themselves from nearly head to toe in North Africa, despite being extremely hot. So the dress codes were very similar for women in Europe and in the Middle East. Women in Europe were allowed to show their hands and their shoes, I almost said feet, but their shoes and their faces and necks, where women in the Middle East and Northern Africa weren't able to show their faces, but the hands and feet at that time were allowed to be shown. So there was very much a lot of similarities that Europeans noticed when in North Africa, in regards to the way women dressed. Felix Bonafé was in Sudan, and he noticed a similar dressing of the women. However, the men were bare-chested and wore waistcoats, shorts, garbs below the waist. In 1884, there became a scramble for Africa. So after people went in, took pictures, brought them back to Europe from Africa after the vacations, there became an understanding that Africa was very rich in resources, and Europe wanted some of that. And Cecil Rhodes, this is a cartoon made of him in a magazine at the time in 1892, and he was a proud imperialist oil magnate from Europe leaving to South Africa, and he was trying to encourage Europeans to have the convention in order to carve up Africa. So here again, we see that Europeans are also mimicking their ancient roots. He is posed over Africa from the tip of South Africa to the top of Africa, but his left foot is in Egypt, by the way. And it was to mimic the Greek port statue Colossus of Rhodes, which was a port city that was very famous in the ancient times and brought in goods from all over the world. So as you see on the right, it's importing goods from the rest of the world. And on the left, Europe is exporting the goods and the resources from Africa around the world, and particularly back to Europe. So here's what the maps looked like. On the left, there was all these societies, all these groups of people, all these languages, all these kingdoms. It's important to note that Africa had kingdoms as well. It is not unique to Europe only. And by the time they were done carving up Africa into the pieces they wanted in 1913 on the right, the biggest countries in Africa were the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the German Empire, Belgium, and a few others sparsely intermixed within the major groupings. This led to Europeans reading Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, which was published in 1899. So just after they were carving up Africa, people began reading this literature. And it was originally written about the Philippine-American War and its annexation, but it became related to conquering of all non-white, non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Christian people. So you see on the right, it looks like a Greco-Roman dressed woman is bringing civilization to the barbarians. And it was a very intense point of view to have, but it was also a very common point of view to have in the late 1800s. People actually believed that these individuals were being saved from themselves, saved from barbarism, saved from being backwards, and that going to these countries, going to these regions was actually very helpful and good for them. African portraiture after colonialism was very much based on hypersexualization of the Black woman. There was, interestingly enough, no artist credits for these images. It almost as if they knew that they didn't want to be attached to such lewd types of photography. These women were naked from the waist up, culturally and ethnically. Africa is also very hot as a continent. It really made no sense to have multiple layers of clothes, like how in Europe they had multiple layers of garments for the women. The men and women were also subjected to dehumanization. So a white hand is holding a number 1424 over this man's head in Allende in Nigeria in 1909. And it relates people to the specification that we would relate plants, animals, natural herbs, minerals, other things that were found in nature. And N.W. Thomas was the first government anthropologist appointed by the British Colonial Office. So they made it a point to have positions in order to categorize and oversee the peoples, share that information back to Europe so that the European colonies could be seen, oversee, understand who they were coming up against when they entered these lands in order to further colonize them. Out of this came human zoos in Europe and the West. Particularly the Congo were presented as half naked and dressed in animal skins. That wasn't necessarily the case. People had entire wardrobes based on your status in society, your gender, and what you do. However, they minimalized the Congolese in particular to wearing animal skins. And there was also books made from this time, Human Zoos, Science and Spectacle in the Age of Colonial Empires. So they were very much well aware what they were doing, how they were categorizing people, and how they were shaping the stereotypes that they put onto other people. And this is an actual advertisement in 1878, New York City. So these individuals were put amongst the animals found in their regions. I'm focusing on Africa in particular. However, the link on the bottom shows that there was people from Asia, Polynesia, the Middle East that were also taken and put into the Bronx Zoo in New York. And the Bronx Zoo and New York City have since apologized profusely every time someone brings it up. There's a think piece article made, and they are very much remorseful for that having been a part of their zoo's history. So we're going to go expansion west into North America. There is a map of the First Nations peoples pre-contact. I want to note Eskimo is a racial slur. The proper term that the Inuit call themselves is Inuit. And you see that there's over 5,000 tribes. This map is a little bit generalized by the region, but within the regions, there are also more subgroups. So the North American continent, as well as the South American continent, were full of peoples pre-European so-called discovery. I just want to say that. George Catlin, he was a portraitist, explorer, and he traveled west from 1830 to 1855, and he was eager to preserve the First Nation imagery and practices. He took that upon himself. He was not officially sent by the United States government. He just wanted to rove around and paint. So here's some examples: buffalo, bulls, back fat, head chief of the blood tribe. He had many images of chiefs, and I call this his first wave of documentation. He later was rewarded for painting these images at the time when photography was just coming into experimentation and coming into practice. So people were still painting during the time of early photography. And maybe if he had waited until he had gotten a camera in his hands, the possibility of him capturing these peoples in the time and places that they were probably would have never happened. So Dakota Chief One Horn in 1832, Matotop, Chief of the Mandan people in 1833. He also had images of women and children with their babies, as well as just individual women. These people are proud, they are dignified, there is no defilement. He found these people and painted these people as we believe they were. There was also a showing of how different their lives were. These were hunters, these were gatherers, these people did not go to stores. There was a bartering system, but the concept of money as we know it was foreign to them. And the goal overall was to do a cultural comparison in order to see how different were they. Now we understand that they weren't that different. They held council, just as the Europeans held conventions in Washington, D.C. But the overall goal was total conversion. So civilization of the Indian in 1833, Joan had gone to Washington, D.C. and had returned with the outfit he has on the right. And that was supposed to be overall what they wanted to happen. We want to get them out of their cultural garb. We want them wearing European style clothing. We want them to embrace the concept of manifest destiny. It's what John Gass painted on the right, called American Progress. And it is the concept that God himself has made it a point to see fit that from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to what is now the Pacific Ocean is under European control, and the peoples that are found are converted to Christianity. They are brought under the concept of capitalism and money systems, and they no longer hold their own councils, and they embrace democracy. During the time when Catlin was painting, the Indian Removal Act was signed into place. Andrew Jackson, the US government, and the military removed First Nation peoples from their original territories. So it was 5,045 miles of trail over land and water that they marched these individuals. They also removed people from the Midwest. So we have Ojibwa, Menominee, Sac Fox, Potawatomi, and they were even removing people as far as New York. So there was a part, as you see, New York Indians, those are the indigenous peoples of what is now considered New York today. They marched them all the way in sections to what is now Oklahoma. And the concept of the Trail of Tears was painted in 1942 by Robert Lindenau. There weren't that many pictures of the trip itself, but there was pictures of the peoples before they were leaving, and they were comfortable, happy, in their rightful places. And here is what the reservation system in Oklahoma looked like at that time. Now it is the purple Indian territory that you see today, including the Eastern Shawnee, Ottawa, Miami, Quapaw, Peoria from Illinois, Modoc, Wyandotte, and Seneca, Cayuga, which are from New York. So all these tribes that weren't even touching each other were crammed into this one piece of state, land. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs today has on their website the map of reservations of federally recognized tribes today. And there is not much land allotted for indigenous peoples. I have a cutout of Florida to the side, where it's Tampa, Brighton, and Miccosukee Seminole Indian tribes in Florida. We have the updated map of Oklahoma. We have the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, Standing Rock, and all this land has slowly been chipped away, allotted, people have been removed, as well as on top of being killed, converted to Western ways of life, that when it came time to say, who's here? Who we need to take accounting for who is here of the original peoples, the amount of peoples were there, but they had been carted off onto little pieces of land called reservations. Also, Alaska has federally recognized tribes as well. And Alaska is huge, and all these dots and all these names are reservations where Alaskan indigenous peoples, Inuit peoples live. The lower part of Alaska is the same thing. Alaska actually hugs the western coast of what is British Columbia, Canada, and there's indigenous tribes even within Canada that are also within Alaska / the United States. So just because there's a border doesn't mean the people stop. It just means that tribes are split between one nation and another. And contemporary photographs of First Nations people. So I'm going to be talking about Aaron Huey. He took these images on the Pine Ridge Reservation from 2006 to 2013. And it is in South Dakota, and it's home of the Oglala Sioux. And the site in which they have the reservation is where American troops shot and killed women and children December of 1890. And I say this is part one because there was a part two, a showdown shootout in the 1970s with the American Indian movement. And this famous photograph shows the 7th Cavalry around the grave that they dug. So they dug a mass grave after they killed the women and children and elders and took a picture and put the bodies into the mass grave and covered it up. And this was a postcard. So Americans got these images, these albumin prints. They were printed and pressed out. They were made into postcards, and people would send them to their families and friends and say, wow, look what happened. Did you hear? Wish you were here. It's a very cold, very dark way that they use photography in order to document the violence they had enacted on indigenous peoples. So the main themes of reservations all over, but particularly Pine Ridge, is indigenous resistance. They're holding the American flag upside down to show their resistance to being occupied and colonized. They hold their traditional spirituality very close to themselves, as many laws were made in order to outlaw, to force people not to learn their traditional spirituality. So things such as the Sundance, things such as Sweat Lodge, where they hold prayer and communion with each other, were outlawed. Dancing was also outlawed, and the honoring of girls and young women were greatly compromised as European colonial forces moved deeper into the Western interior of what is now the United States. Men would abduct young girls, young women. We even still have this issue today with the murdered and missing indigenous women and girls. That is a hashtag that goes over a movement where when an indigenous woman or girl goes missing, they put an alert out within all the indigenous communities to make sure they go look for her, because they are some of the highest rated missing and murdered cases for women in the nation. And yet we hear nothing about when an indigenous woman or girl goes missing. We oftentimes only hear about her when the family has found her body and is holding a funeral. Unacceptable. So this culture really embraces their women and their girls. They say their women and girls and their children, including boys too, are sacred and they are our future. They also show where they erect their natural housing. Houses that we live in today are not typical to the houses that they traditionally put up in the Pine Ridge Reservation. So they're preserving their culture in more ways than one. But when they do live in houses, mobile homes, there is still a sense of great poverty on the reservation due to the fact that there are no jobs in the region. You must oftentimes leave the reservation in order to receive an education. And when you receive an education outside of the reservation, it is hard because you come back and there are no jobs for you to utilize your education in. So oftentimes people will leave the reservation and stay within cities outside of the reservation, come back to visit their family, their friends, but it's very much a dead zone. And Huey has captured the interactions between people on the reservation. What you see on TV, it's much deeper than that. The children play, there's a deep sense of poverty. The children, at times, they don't know it until they get older and they see their other classmates, their non-Indigenous classmates, have things like running water, electricity, internet. And so they're able to understand the disparity of the reservation by interacting with American children outside the reservation. And Huey really, really just captures these moments so beautifully. It is not all doom and gloom. They are still a proud people, the Oglala Sioux. They hold their customs and their traditions very closely to themselves to this day. Very interesting compositions, colors, the sunset. So you see the old traditional ways mixing with the new integrated reservation system that the United States has built for these people. Children standing on top of cars with the laundry lines. This is their normal. So to us, it is very much a shock if you haven't seen an American Indian reservation. But to them, the land is their home. The reservation is just something that was put onto their home. It's kind of hard to leave your home when you are gated within your home. So where are you going to go otherwise? You are home. But unfortunately, your home has the marks and the scars of colonialism all over it. The Oglala Sioux Nation has some of the highest rates of domestic violence, poverty, and alcoholism. And it is very much a difficult topic for people to have and to talk about. Wounded Knee, where they had the massacre, now a sign. They say, don't forget the Battle of Wounded Knee. Many indigenous peoples that are not Oglala Sioux have made it a point to understand other regions' history. And Aaron Huey's photographs of First Nations people is the second wave of documentation. So Catlin was the first wave that I considered. I consider Huey the second wave because he shows what has happened after the occupation, after the colonialism has hit. Let's take a step back. Do we really need to care about America's past? I really do think we need to care about America's past. I Googled the team, I'll just say the R word, and the first thing that came up was not the football team, but the racial slur for a North American Indian. or a Native American, as we say. And these people have lobbied for many decades for the football teams and the baseball teams to change their names from racial slurs. They are not honoring us, they say. They're actually disrespecting us, because the only time you talk about us is when this football team comes out, wins, loses, but you don't pay us any mind that we're on the reservation, that we lack resources. And so after many, many decades of pushing, just this year, the Washington team changed their name from the Washington R words to the Commanders. It has taken maybe 40 years of protesting, 40 years of speaking out, that they finally heard and listened and changed the name. Now we need to change the Chiefs, the Braves. We need to stop the tomahawk chop and all the other teams that have indigenous names that need to be changed. Pick another word, pick another name. It's not that hard to respect people. Taking a step back, what is appreciation? What is misappropriation? The use of Asian women and Asian motifs. This has been very popular in the West. It's now in the United States. Gwen Stefani and her backup entourage, the Harajuku girls. This was the early 2000s, where it was very niche to be into Hello Kitty, anime, and Japan. But we know nothing of them as individuals. They are posed as her collective. It is a very strange phenomena to have an entourage where they don't speak, they make their gestures, they appear in music videos. It is very much making them props. Rihanna, Princess of China, put out in 2011. She was dressed as a sexy Chinese geisha. Japan had geishas, not China. And it just seemed like an amalgamation of just so many different Asian cultures in that music video, that she and her team could have, in my opinion, really taken the time to either make it Chinese or make it a particular Asian culture, or hire a female actress to play the love interest in the music video that was of Asian descent. It was a very weird thing that they called her out on, and she answered to it. The video is still up, I believe. Iggy Azalea made Bounce, where she went to India and she was in the center of East Asian women. They were dancing around her. We understand in the West that when you put something in the center or the top, it is considered the most important. And so people had a backlash against Iggy Azalea because, once again, a non-woman of color is centering herself in a POC or people of color culture. And people were calling on her to say, think, what does this look like? This is so common for people of color to center whiteness, blonde hair, blue eyes, that now you're coming into our culture. It wasn't necessarily disrespectful, but the way she placed herself among the other women in relation to the music video showed more of a self-centering. And she looks different than all the women who were dark skinned, dark hair, dark eyed. So placing whiteness at the center always can create a dialogue that many artists don't want to have, but people will continue to call them out on. And taking a step back again, where do we see stereotyping then? Where did they see stereotyping then? So the Victorian bustle put up under the dress was to mimic the large buttocks seen particularly in Sarah Bartman, who was a South African woman who was put in a human zoo during her lifetime. As soon as she was found, they coerced her. there was some payment, but it was mainly coercing for her to gain the circus and the zoo that she was touring with notoriety. After she passed away in 1815, her body was put on display in a museum. She was stuffed like taxidermy, how we do animals in today. And her remains weren't returned to South Africa and buried into 2002. So, wow. Nearly 200 years of being on tour. It's really an intense thing to consider. Where do these fashions come from? Where does this butt craze or this butt love mania come from? Where do we see the stereotyping now? We have our favorites, Beyonce, Shakira, Amber Rose, J-Lo. There's even a song by Sir Mix-a-Lot, Baby Got Back. So the behind worship, we have to call into consideration, where do these things come from? Why do we seem drawn to certain things? Why do we seem to trend other things? Why is our fashion built to make us focus on a particular type of body shape, a particular body part? Where is this coming from? And why am I being prompted to think this way? So I'm going to show you my sources. Many sources for this time around, from the Albumin Prince, Africa, imperialism in general, the taking a step back. Oh, I accidentally touched the hyperlink. The Native American sources, multiple of them. And for next week, we're going to be talking about the battlefield and the parlor, Civil War, the Gilded Age, and the rise of industrialization from 1861 to 1900. All right. Any questions? So it's time to unmute yourself and ask questions.
I have a question. It seems to me that when in an attempt to gather from others, there's been a focus on not necessarily focusing on the beauty of the region. So let's say there was reaching into Asia or Africa or the East. Those that were there didn't seem to be there to take photos or imagery for the beauty of the space, but just to document who was there. What was that all about? To me, there seemed to have been just documentation for the purpose of documentation, not necessarily to show that the region was a good place to have visited, a good place to have toured, but to go from what you're showing, to go and actually show who was there for purposes of then bringing that information back to use for different purposes. So what was that all about?
There was a great fascination with people that were considered different, exotic. So when people center themselves, I'm going to say the blonde hair, blue-eyed, European standard or look. So when you find in a different place, naturally people don't look like you. There was a fascination, there was fetish. There was also a demonization of people. But the original times people were going out, it was, I would consider it the fascination with this new technology, which is photography, the fascination with being in a different place outside of Europe, seeing different cultures. So there was a great fascination, But when those individuals that were of the higher status, upper echelon came back and brought their photography back to their anthropology friends, who are also upper echelon, their scientist friends, their friends and family who are in government, there became an interest in the photography to see who and what was out there, what resources, what can be utilized, and how do we go from these people that don't know we exist or don't know much about us at all, if they do know we exist, to having full control over them in their regions, and they're willfully participating in their own colonization. So they had to see who was out there to see who they're up against. Oftentimes they arrived, there was warriors that fought, it was the gun versus the spear, it was the knife versus the hand, and they had to minimize the blowback from the warrior societies in these cultures, and oftentimes they would eradicate the warrior class. They would just deal with the women and children. The women and children would fall in line because the women would tell the children or raise the children to be fearful, to be compliant, to cooperate. And the beginnings of the raising people to have a colonial mindset began just based on knowing who to take out. They made sure to show what the men looked like. When I was going through all these images of all these cultures, there was a high focus on the men. What did the men look like? How tall were they? Did they look strong? How many men were there? How many men were there compared to women? They often overestimated how they believed there was more men than women when it was more like a 50-50, but because when someone comes into your village, your zone, you don't put your women and children out there, you have the men step out. And so they oftentimes came a little bit harder at the village and the other cultural societies, because there's maybe 200 men there. It's like, no, it's a small village. But you overestimated because all the warriors stood out and watched the boat pull up. They watched you ride in on horseback of, who's this guy? Who are these guys with these boxes? Why are they, what is this? They didn't know pictures, but they're like, what is this box and what does it do? Why are they pointing this in my face? This is so strange. And then they left. And then the next wave of colonization came. And so photography was used in order to document, and to the point where now certain cultures know the intensity of photography. Many people don't want to be photographed in these cultures today, these rural cultures, these civilizations that are still living as they did. They see you coming with a camera, they're like, no pictures. No. They're picking up their children, they're taking them inside of their dwellings. They don't want any images created. What are the images going to be used to do? That was always a thought. What is this? Where are these pictures going? And so when these pictures exited, well, the human zoos became a thing. So now you don't look at pictures anymore. We're going to have the real thing. We're going to have these people, we're going to pick these people up, coerce them, pay them pennies on the dollar, say they're performers, put them in the zoos, have them do their cultural thing, and have everybody in the Western Europe go, yay, that was amazing. I didn't even have to travel. I'll just go to the New York Zoo in the Bronx and go see some Africans, some Asians, some Native Americans. It became very much a strange way to use photography in order to get something more out of it, which is live performance. So yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, they misused it in order to see what people were doing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions?
It's not so much a question, but I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I work at the Autry Museum, and we actually have John Gass painting of American Progress. So I feel like I never seem to escape that painting.
It haunts you.
Yeah, it really does. We actually don't have it currently back in our collection. It's on loan. It's on its way back. But
Mhm.
Wendy Red Star, who is Absolute or Absolute,
Yes.
like a band of the Crow Nation. So she actually just finished a show. It was hosted. I had to look up the college, but it was at the Anderson Collection at Stanford. So she actually just did a
Wow.
show about American Progress. So she borrowed that piece, and we actually have some of Wendy Red Star's pieces as well, just to discuss that. So I think it's interesting that, like, time and time again, this painting in particular
Mhm.
comes up, and it's always used as a discussion point in U.S. history lessons,
Yeah.
for both sides of the coin, unfortunately, about like saying why Manifest Destiny was such a great thing, and then deconstructing it now in high school and college level courses.
Mhm.
So it's interesting to see that photo again,
Yeah.
or sorry, that image again, in your
Yeah.
in your lecture.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I saw it for the first time in 7th grade history class, but it was more introduced as like, yeah, that's what they believe. Next, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's very key. That's
Yeah.
key. We gloss over it really quickly, but I think that can have a whole class on just manifest destiny and the paintings and the rhetoric and the belief systems of imperialism, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. And those photos of
Mhm.
like even of Matahari, which I had I hadn't learned about her before, so I'm glad
Mhm.
that you shared that, and those images, right? That for me, like, I've seen some older posters right around that time in the World's Fair, and having
Mhm.
these views of these Javanese dancers and not realizing it's because I like, they had some stuff at LACMA for a recent exhibit, and with those posters, I kept thinking it was a similar thing. If it was just, the zoos, unfortunately, and these quote unquote cultural exhibitions where they're just kind of exploiting these dancers and bringing them over on ships, but also not realizing that, like, oh yeah, there are, urine people impersonating and pretending and saying they are, of some sort of Asian descent in order to perform and gain money. So it's just like the exploitation of these cultures in more than one way.
Yeah.
That's happening over years that people forget about. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. I thought about it. I really thought about it because I said there's got to be some. We understand the African aspect, we understand the Native American aspect, but oftentimes we forget about Asia. We're just like, oh yeah, we just start talking about Asia in the World War times, Japan, Vietnam War. It's like, no, they were over there and they were interacting with people way before these modern wars. What was going on? What did they think about certain ways that women walked and lived in society? And comparing, I don't want to compare Matahari to a geisha, but completely different. This no way. There was no way you would see a geisha or the Javanese, Indonesian women, the traditional dances that were performed, and go, I'm going to spin this in Europe. People asked Matahari, what are the origins? Oh, they're ancient. I was shown these ancient ways. I was so privileged. I just was shown these religious. It's like, wait a minute. You're conflating cultural ways with Western ideas of the showgirl. And no one checked her. No one could check her. I'm pretty sure she tried to do that 2020, 2021, 2022. They would have had her head. She would have been canceled like 80 times. She would have been on the cover of People as what not to do. She would have had to issue an apology on YouTube, the crying apology video. that we all are familiar with, unfortunately. But yeah, I noticed Asia is always left out of the discussion, and I wanted to mine that in particular. Yeah. Any more questions? Anybody? Questions, comments, thoughts? Anything else? Let's see. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Anything else? Anybody else? Comments, questions, concerns, interests? Let me start the video. See me. Hello. Hi, everybody. Okay. So that was week 2 of 9. So thank you, everybody that's been here with me. I do this because I love this. I love art. I love history. I love photography. So I'm going to continue on all the way up until modern times. I really want to talk about TikTok. Not yet, though. We have to wait till the end. Want to talk about Instagram. Gonna wait till the end. But there's so much more coming up, so many more historical pieces that we often don't find or hear about. And I think that is really important to bring out, especially if you can make your own curriculum. Make things that you want to see. Make things that are interesting to you, and hopefully you find other people that are interested in the same things you're interested in too. All right. It is 7 o'clock. I'm 2 minutes over the hour. So thank you, everybody. I will see you next week. All right. Bye-bye.